You know, I'm really enjoying having a camera that I can hang in a tree. Let's talk about it. What's up everybody, welcome back to NBC Arts. On this channel we talk about filmmaking gear, tips and tutorials, and today you may notice some things like a little bit different, a little bit wider, maybe the audio sounds different. That's because I'm recording with a completely different setup today. This video is the review of the Canon EOS RP and everything that it can basically do, and I wanted to give you guys the best kind of example of what it could do for like YouTube videos like this, like a sit down talking head interview kind of thing, as well as some like B-roll outside, and in the future we'll do like a vlogging test with it and stuff like that. But for this review I just wanted to talk about kind of what the camera can do, what I've thought about, what I've thought of it using it for the past couple of weeks since I've purchased it, and whether it might be a good fit for you to purchase yourself. So to start off, I'm not going to really bore you with the tech specs. There's a lot of videos out there on the internet about this camera right now, and I know I'm kind of late to the game, but I'm super jazzed about this camera. I think it's a really cool thing to pick up. But so let's just start off with some of the basic specs it can do. This camera is has a full frame 26 megapixel sensor. The burst rates for the camera is about like 3 to 4 frames per second when taking photos. Video specs wise, it's not super impressive, but it can record 4K up to 24 frames a second. 1080p up to 60 frames per second, and as well as can record in 720p, but I don't think most of you will be using that mode very much. So some other photography specs that it has, it does have focus bracketing mode as well, which is like really cool. I've never really heard of this before up until this camera, but it's where like if you set your camera on a tripod and you want to take a landscape, it like takes pictures like at different focal distances, or different focus distances, and then compiles it into one image, so like everything is in focus and tack sharp, which I think is super cool, especially since I shoot a lot of landscapes. I don't really shoot a lot of landscapes. I shouldn't say that. I don't shoot a lot of landscapes, but that's primarily what I shoot. I think that's going to come in super handy. It also has a great time-lapse function. I've never had that in any camera that I've had, so I'm really excited to test that out in some future up-and-coming vlogs. We're going to get some variety content. Maybe, you know, go outside. I know, foreign concept, but we're gonna go outside one day. So yeah, frames per second on this camera. It doesn't shoot fast. So if you're kind of a sports guy or a wildlife guy, this probably might not be the camera for you. This camera, like I said before, does like 3 frames a second when shooting photos continuously. And if you're doing like sports and wildlife, you're probably gonna want something that shoots a little bit faster than that, so you can capture the entire moment and make sure you don't miss that perfect shot of what you need. Especially since those kind of live events or those kinds of situations are kind of like, you don't really have a whole lot of control about what's going to happen. Whereas if you were like a portrait photographer, a landscape photographer, or like a wedding photographer, you have more control over the situation that you're in than you would in those specific situations. So if you need something that shoots higher frames per second, this probably isn't the camera for you. So anyway, to get into the photography aspects of this, I did take this out shooting with me. Due to the rising cases of COVID-19, I decided not to go and do what my original plan was to go to a state park and stuff like that, but except I kind of stayed local. I went out to a walking path kind of near my house and stuff like that to try and kind of minimize my exposure to other people, as well as minimize others' exposure to me as well, to help do my part to kind of beat this thing so we can all get back to normal and get back to our regular everyday lives. But sad talk out of the way, this camera was awesome to shoot with. Now, the one thing that I did want to test while taking photos with this camera was the dynamic range. If you watch some videos on this camera, you'll definitely see that it doesn't have the biggest dynamic range in the world, which is okay because it's a $1,000 camera. But I found the dynamic range to be quite acceptable, especially when you're shooting in RAW. Now with RAW, as you may know, there's a lot more data for you to kind of manipulate in post when editing your photos, let's say in Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever you may use, like Skylum or whatever it's called. But while editing these photos in post, I found that there was plenty of dynamic range for me to use, especially when shooting in RAW. If you shoot in JPEG, you're going to be kinda sorta out of luck. Not really though. Even if you do shoot in JPEG, I think it's fine. The only thing that I could possibly see where the dynamic range would be an issue is like, say, something with a landscape. If you have like a huge, if your highlights may be blown out or your shadows may be crushed, it may kind of give you some issues there. But if you're like a portrait photographer, you do like weddings and stuff, I think this camera is an absolute steal for the money. I think the dynamic range, the pictures come out so sharp, so wonderful. 26 megapixels is enough, I promise. Even with all those 61 megapixel cameras out there and these high megapixel cameras, I think 26 megapixels is like the sweet spot a little bit for just about everyday use. If you are going to be printing like large prints for like a photo gallery where people are going to be like up and close and personal to your prints, you may want to look into something different. But for the most of us, where most of our photography ends up on Instagram anyway, I mean, guilty. I think this camera would be just wonderful for that. Now, let's get into video. Now, while filming with this camera, I've had some headaches for sure. This is the third time I'm recording this sit-down interview portion of the video. And man, did I come across some issues. Not issues for the camera per se, because it's like, I mean, part of it's the camera, part of it's me, part of it's, you know, just the situation. So the main issues that I've had is not with picture quality. I think the picture quality is phenomenal, especially when filming in full frame. 1080p looks amazing, but it's been the audio. Canon consumer cameras like this, like their DSLRs, their mirrorless, whatever, are known to have pretty bad preamps, and I'm used to things like XLR connections with like my my recorder, which I will get to. I will make what's in my audio bag. I will make that eventually. But I'm used to like XLR ports and using the preamps that are on my C200, which are a huge step up from this. So that's something to keep in mind. You do want to make sure you choose the correct mic for the job when using this. I was using some wireless labs before and they weren't really working out, but I think I found a pretty cool solution, which we'll talk about in a future video. I didn't want to bog down with like the setup that I'm using for this. I can leave that to another video. Not make this too long. I mean, I want to spend time with you guys, don't worry. Canon cameras are known for being very user-friendly, and I've gotten that very much with this camera. And like, I traded to this camera from a Sony a6500, and I didn't really see it as an upgrade so much as more of a sidestep. I was like giving up some things that the Sony did well to give to get some of the things that this camera does well. Like, I was giving up an APS-C sensor for a full frame sensor. I was giving up frames per second when shooting pictures for the slower rates on this camera. And the big thing that I gave up was log recording and 4K video recording with decent autofocus with this camera. And I think that's the biggest hang up that a lot of people have with this camera is the 4K. Let's get it out of the way. There's a crop. Everybody get over it. It's fine. You know, not everything has to be on full frame. I've shot with crop sensor cameras my entire career up to this point, and they're fine. My C200, an amazing camera's crop sensor. You know, up until this point, major cinema cameras have had crop sensors. So, I mean, for me, the crop wasn't a super big deal. I didn't really plan on using 4K anyway. When I shoot these videos, even on my C200, I shoot in 1080p. I do shoot in 4K for some parts of them, but man, like having 4K all the time, like that's a lot of data to store, and storage is expensive. Very expensive. Getting all that out of the way, the 4K is usable if you use manual focus lenses like cinema lenses and stuff like that, and you're able to pull focus very well, because the one thing you do give up when going to 4K with this camera is the dual pixel autofocus. It's not enabled in 4K like it is on the Canon EOS R, so that's something you're gonna have to give up. But at the same time, I do think most of the people that are gonna be buying this camera are gonna be shooting in 1080p anyway. Heck, most of the people that buy the EOS R shoot in 1080p anyway because they want that full frame sensor, and I do really like shooting with this full frame sensor. The lens I'm shooting on it right now is the Tamron 17-35 f2.8 to f4, and it's kind of getting a little bit too used to. Like, I didn't want to like spend a ton of money and get a L lens, like a 16-35 L lens for this, or like the new 15-35 RF lens for this camera. I wanted to kind of keep it on the you know, the cheaper side, just because this camera is going to be kind of going with me everywhere. And if I take like a really nice lens, like traveling with me, and it gets busted up, you know, I'm out more money than I am out with this lens. It's a really good budget lens if you're looking into getting into vlogging and stuff like that. So, but we'll do a future review on this lens. I think this lens is kind of a sleeper almost. I mean, if you don't really mind the variable aperture thing, I think this lens would be a great option. But yeah, we'll go over that in a future episode. So yeah, shooting with full frame 1080p is awesome. It's been so great. I think if you pick up this camera, you're gonna just enjoy shooting a lot. I have installed Technicolor CineStyle. That's what I'm filming in right now. It does, I mean, it gives you like a bit more dynamic range, but not a whole lot. It just kind of lowers the contrast, gives you a flatter profile. So that's kind of how I'm getting away with like no log, because I do like log recording. I think log recording is super beneficial to video. So if you do need a true log format, probably not the camera for you. I would kind of look into something like the Canon EOS R, but you are going to pay double the price for that one feature. So something to keep in mind. Maximum frame rates on this camera only goes up to 60 frames a second, which for me is enough. Like I don't really use 120 frames. I used to be all about 120 frames, especially when I got into video and I was watching like Peter McKinnon and his super buttery 120 frames a second slow-mo stuff. It was just so good. And so I thought 120 frames was great for like everything, and I was shooting everything at 120 frames and slowing everything down. But you know, the more I've kind of gotten into video, the more I've kind of left 120 frames a second and found that 60 frames a second is enough for me, especially with slow-mo. I shoot a lot of handheld, and 60 frames is enough for me to kind of slow it down and kind of, you know, minimize the amount of camera shake in here too. And I think if you don't need a lot of high frame rate stuff, that this camera is a really great option for you. Speaking of handheld, this camera does not offer IBIS, but it does offer electronic image stabilization. So what's the difference between the two of them? Well, IBIS is where they physically stabilize the sensor inside of the camera, and the sensor moves depending on how you move the camera with your hands. But electronic image stabilization crops in on the image a little bit and does that digitally. The crop is not huge, especially when only like using it on its like lowest setting, which is what I use it on. It has like 3 settings, which is off, on, and then enhanced mode. And enhanced mode when it kind of crops in a little bit more. But what I've noticed filming with this camera is that it gets a little warpy, a little wavy and stuff like that. But yeah, I thought that the electronic stabilization is enough to compensate for not having an optically stabilized lens, which you can't get for this camera. And I think if you use both in conjunction with each other, you're gonna get a very stable image, especially if you're vlogging and you kind of have like one of those switch pods or a Joby Gorilla Pod or something like that, and you get your hands away from the camera body itself, you're gonna come out with a really great stable image. So without further ado, let's get into some B-roll I shot with this camera. So, final thoughts on this camera. I think this camera could be an absolute steal for the right person. If you're a sports photographer or a wildlife photographer, probably not your camera. If you're really serious about video and you need a camera that does everything, that does both the photo side and some really high quality video. Not that this camera doesn't do high quality video, it just doesn't have as many specs as a videographer would want. Probably not the camera for you. But if you're like me and you already own a dedicated video camera and you just want a B camera to take around vlogging, or use a camera that has a full frame sensor for photography and you don't do those sports and wildlife shoots, I think this camera is a great option. It allows you to have a full frame sensor for not a whole lot of cash. Sure, the dynamic range might not be as much as like the EOS R or other offerings from like Sony or something like that, but I think it's enough for you to still get some great images out of. Even if you're a beginner and you're looking to get into the full frame kind of world and you've been kind of shooting with APS-C cameras and you want to just kind of jump into full frame, I think this camera is a steal, an absolute steal. I think this camera's kind of a sleeper for 2020, and for a lot of people this camera makes sense. So yeah, if you're looking into getting this camera, don't worry about like the stigma that comes with it, like, oh, it's an entry-level camera or whatever else. Just get the camera. If the camera makes you excited to shoot, that's the right camera for you. So guys, that's about it for me. If you liked the video, hit that like button, leave a comment down below. If you want to see more from me, hit that subscribe button, ring that bell for notifications, and thanks again so much for watching. We will see you in the next video. See you later, guys.